what I'm coming here to talk to you about today is a security journey. How many of you have heard of the book or seen the movie Eat, Pray, Love? Right? Yeah, I had not seen the movie. I barely got through the book because, it seemed irrelevant to me in my chosen profession. But I realized that we're all on some kind of a journey. They say with security isn't a destination, it's a journey. Have you all heard that one before? So that book was apparently about this one woman's journey to kind of discover herself and life. And so I'm going to take you today through a very fast-forward tour of my own security journey, and hopefully you'll find some useful things in it. So who am I? If the clicker works. Click. Yes, this is a word cloud of my Twitter stream, so you can kind of get an overall impression of who I am as a person and what I care about. Yes, apparently karaoke is big on that list. Any of you know a place tonight for karaoke? Okay, great. Talk to me later. But these are the things that I've done in my professional career, and we're going to talk about a few of them in my little security journey with you today. So first things first, in the whole eat, pray, love trifecta, the eating is the part of her life where she's kind of enjoying the pleasures of the flesh, right? So she's eating a lot. She's having a lot of relationships past her marriage and all that stuff. And the praying part is when she gets spiritual, and the love part is when she tries to balance it out. So in that same vein, first of all, let's eat. So where did I start my career in security? I learned how to hack things. Actually, your opening keynote today, Tyler Shields, and one of your other keynotes who's sitting in the audience, Chris Heng, and we all shared a common hereditary hacker history that we were all part of the artist formerly known as At Stake. Does anyone remember At Stake? Some of you folks who are standing at the end will definitely remember At Stake. So we were among the first hackers for hire who were actively testing application layer security. And that company was formed in 1999. I joined in 2003 after being an independent hacker for hire for quite some time. And the title of this slide is where I learned empathy. So yes, I was hacking in a pink hoodie with a pink Hello Kitty TV. That was a video game hacking that I was doing at that time professionally. But it was an interesting thing. It was a gig like no other in my penetration testing career. We were always looking for, all of the usual security issues that you would find. We were also looking, because it was gaming, we were looking for ways to steal credit card information. So all of that stuff that you look for as a penetration tester. But this was the beginning of my professional empathy and kind of unlocked the doors for other things that would follow. The professional empathy I developed on this particular gig was profound because I was listing all of the different typical security vulnerabilities that we found. And they said, yep, but we've got risk mitigation in place to deal with that. We've got risk mitigation in place to deal with credit card fraud. We've got risk mitigation in place to deal with all of these other types of breaches. And we're rolling out, stronger two-factor authentication momentarily. It took them 10 years. But, they felt like they had it handled in a lot of the traditional security sense. What they didn't have a good sense of was something that could actually end their business and their investment in this video game title. And they wanted to know all the ways in which we could cheat. That's what they hired us for. They hired us to cheat at video games. Boy, was this a really great gig. I managed to set this up at the front of the At Stake office just to rub it in everybody's faces that I was playing video games for a whole week. But we were trying to cheat because that was their business bottom line. And so while I was doing my usual pen test gig, this was the beginnings of me understanding what business risk meant as opposed to my traditional myopic view of I can break in the following ways. And this is why you should pay attention to me because I am the security expert and you are not, right? I needed to pay attention to them and figure out what it was that they really wanted and what it was that they were really afraid of. So fast forward, I'd also taken a turn as a Linux developer in the early part of my career, so I knew what it was like to ship some code, right? Not necessarily big production level enterprise code, but, some Linux code, right? So one of the things I knew already and already had empathy for was the fact that all software, of a certain size at least, will contain security vulnerabilities. And then rather than get kind of bogged down in the fact that it's going to rain, eventually I started changing what my career focus was. So rather than breaking things and even understanding which things I should break and in what order to really understand, the business risk of my clients, I started thinking about, well, how do I help them build more secure software? How do I help them stop making the same coding mistakes over and over that lead to me getting very bored on my penetration tests, finding the same bugs over and over? Right, so I began to expand, and I thought, okay, well, this I actually pulled from Twitter today because someone just had to say it in a Venn diagram, and I thought this was great. There's no really easy solution that contains all of this fast, cheap, secure, magical mojo. So there's always a dynamic, right? And you hear about this all the time. Security and functionality, there's a necessary trade-off of that. We've gotten much better at securing the functionality that users and businesses actually need, but we still haven't adopted all of these great security practices. So in my own evolution, I thought, well, if I just enable more people to find more bugs and show how prevalent this is, then I'm not just one penetration tester. I can help empower an entire worldwide army of penetration testers potentially. Some of you guys have heard the word bug bounty mentioned a few times, right? Bug bounties, you all know what they are. Okay. So I started a couple of research programs. This was when I was at Symantec, when Symantec had bought At Stake, and half of my friends went off to form ISEC partners. And I decided that I was going to stay and just do this one thing that I thought was going to take a month, and that was create Symantec vulnerability research. This was simply a means for us existing hackers to publish our security research and have a vuln disclosure policy. And I thought, this is going to be dead simple. We'll just use the at-stake vuln disclosure policy, and we'll go. Giant mega corporation taught me differently, right? Eventually, I did launch Symantec vulnerability research, and we did, as a group, find a whole lot of vulnerabilities in third-party products and report them. But what I was noticing was I thought it would be easier to report vulnerabilities if we were wearing the giant Symantec yellow cape of saying, we're a security company and we're here to help. But in fact, we got as much hostile reception from some of the vendors that were unaware and unprepared of this process as we did when we were at stake or as we did when we were individual security researchers. So it didn't actually change our reception in the world. Definitely got threatening phone calls, threatening letters, cease and desist, that kind of thing, when we were trying to report a security vulnerability. So then I thought, okay, well, you know what? If being in one mega corporation wasn't enough for me, why don't I join the biggest software company in the world? And so I joined Microsoft as a security strategist. And it was there that I launched Microsoft's first bug bounty programs and actually wrote their very first coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy. They didn't have one before that. They were pointing to a dead link that had been sitting on the internet for a few years from back in 2004 called the Organization for Internet Safety. Some of you folks who have been at this for a long time, do you remember OIS? Okay, no one but me. That's good. That's great. So that was what Microsoft was pointing to before I wrote their vuln disclosure policy. So here's a little bit of history of vuln disclosure and bug bounty programs. This is a slide borrowed from my friends at BugCrowd. They are a bounty service provider. I'll talk about those very, very briefly later. But essentially, you saw nothing new under the paying for security bugs sun for a long time after Netscape had started theirs. And then in 2010, Google started a bug bounty program for just their browser. And at that point, I was at Microsoft, and my management said to me, Katie, if we were to do a bug bounty program, what would that look like? And so I embarked on what eventually turned into a 3-year journey, another journey, where I was looking for ways to implement this in the biggest software company in the world with over 800 supported products, many of them down-level supported of the same product, and lots of complexities, right? And it took 3 years, but eventually I did launch Microsoft's first ever bug bounty programs. And up until Apple had announced their program, Microsoft's was the biggest ongoing bug bounty program that was not tied to an individual contest in the world. And that held for about 3 years. So big difference between bug bounty programs and vulnerability disclosure programs. Does anybody know really what the difference is? Gosh, I tried to wake you up. Oh, wait, there is somebody who will say something. Yes? Oh, you know the difference. Okay. He's not going to say it, though. Okay, I'll say it. That's fine. The difference really is that vulnerability disclosure itself is the base practice of finding out about potential vulnerabilities from somebody else outside your organization and then doing your best to investigate and fix it. Whereas a bug bounty program is simply an incentive that lays on top of a primal vulnerability disclosure program. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but one statistic that is really important, in our little InfoSec bubble, we hear the term bug bounty bandied around like it's a common practice. It is still in its very early stages of what I call the defense economy for vulnerabilities and exploits. We all know that bugs of a certain type in certain products can fetch huge sums of money. Exploits that are fully functional, even more sums of money than an individual bug. We've known that for a very long time, and that economy has been going for quite some time. But the defense economy for vulnerabilities is very, very, very short-lived so far. And most companies, so when you take the Forbes Top 2000, you think companies with a lot of risk prevention, tons of security budget, tons of expertise in-house who are actually trying to practice all of the best practices, following ISO standards and doing all that stuff. And yet, you see that 94% of them have no public way to report a vulnerability to them. That would imply that the majority of that 94% don't even have a secret way to report a vulnerability to them. So they have no vuln disclosure process. So when people bandy about the term of bug bounties are really catching on, I would love for that to be true, but as it's just a subset of vulnerability disclosure, and vulnerability disclosure itself has not been that broadly adopted as an industry practice, I will beg to differ that the data outside of our InfoSec bubble tells us something very, very different. So, okay, clicker, right. So I've heard this a lot where people will say that bug bounties could replace penetration testing. That's just not true. There are differences in what you get, differences in how you can structure these things, but essentially you will always still need to do professional penetration testing, especially for things that you can't necessarily easily crowdsource. I heard a bunch of IoT talk this morning, or early this afternoon, and in fact, that industry, it's quite difficult to do consistent public bug bounties. You can do hybrid things, which is a hybrid between a penetration test and a bug bounty, a crowdsourced type of look at your security. But it's going to be very different in terms of dynamic. So, quick overview, not going to spend too much time on this, but in North America, there are 3 main bounty service providers, and I work with all of them. Their differences right now, they're converging a lot of their services, but at this moment, this is what they sort of look like and what they can give to an organization, right? So the easy button for triage. How many people are familiar with the term triage? I found this out in some other conference I spoke at that was a security conference, that somebody asked me, what did you mean? You kept saying triage. And I was like, oh boy, I should ask next time. So triage is essentially ascertaining whether or not something's a bug, how severe it is, and in the case of a bug bounty program, how much should you pay out? That's roughly, and what order you might fix it in. Say you have all critical vulnerabilities coming in. What order? How do you prioritize fixing them when they're all doomsday, right? So that's triage. HackerOne, where I used to work, has a platform for power users. So if you have the staff and the in-house know-how or the playbooks already written on how to do triage appropriately and consistently, for example, and you have a large volume of incoming reports, there's a lot of automation built into that platform that's meant for the power user. That's great if you want your security staff actually spending time doing triage. Some people do it because they're sensitive about whose eyes actually get to see your bugs. Even a service like that is unacceptable to a lot of vendors with long times to fix, like Microsoft and Apple, where yes, they might love the tools that definitely give them an advantage over email, but no, absolutely not do they want anyone else to see their bugs, and nor do they want to house their bugs in a cloud service. So there are still drawbacks. And then Synack, I call them adult pen test friend finder. They are basically, okay, 3 of you know what I was talking about. Adult Friend Finder is some kind of a naughty dating site that I've heard of and never, ever gone to visit. So that is Synack, and in a nutshell, they're Adult Pen Test Friend Finder. They're basically a clearinghouse for individual, more highly vetted security researchers who may participate in a crowdsourced model, but it's much more controlled and much closer to your traditional penetration test. There may be legal agreements that they sign similar to someone doing a traditional penetration test. So there's a broad spectrum of assistance that's out there, but what about all of the basics on the back end, right? So let's see, first of all, oops, let's go through a really quick case study of Microsoft's first ever bug bounty programs, and then the evolution of that into the first ever United States government bug bounty programs, all of which I've had a hand in, fortunately or unfortunately. So remember I said that I was asked in 2010, what would a Microsoft bug bounty program look like? Well, after 3 years and being told not just by my management team, but also having executives publicly quoted saying they would never pay hackers money for vulnerabilities, I launched those. So those were Microsoft's very first bug bounty programs. There's a few key differences here. Traditional bug bounty programs are one bug, one bounty to a single finder of the vulnerability. What we did here was we did $100,000 for brand new exploitation techniques. How many of you are familiar with ASLR, DEP, all of the different mitigation options that are available across many platforms, not just Microsoft, right? So these are things that make it harder to exploit an individual vulnerability, harder to write an exploit, and make those exploits less reliable. So return-oriented programming or JIT spray are examples of mitigation bypasses. If you've heard those words before, now I'm mesmerizing you with my alphabet soup. Okay, so anyway, take it for granted that these are exploitation techniques that defeat all of the protective countermeasures on the system that are available at a given time. So we were paying $100,000 for a new technique that could bypass all of those protective countermeasures. So we were told that that wasn't enough, that there's no way that somebody who had something that valuable would ever give it up for a mere $100,000. We were also told that $11,000 for an IE11 vulnerability, a critical vulnerability in IE11, was also not enough. How many of you have heard of six-figure payouts for vulnerabilities in the latest browsers? Some of you have definitely heard this. Okay, yes, thank you, at least one of you. All right, so we were told that none of this was going to work, that no one was going to come forward. And this is a place where people's common sense was actually telling them the wrong thing. Because what they were missing was this essential piece of data, which I knew, which was that for no money at all, over 200,000 non-spam email messages a year were coming in to secure at Microsoft. These were altruistic hackers who wanted to improve the security of the world by telling Microsoft for free about potential vulnerabilities. Now, not all of them turned out to be real vulnerabilities. But the important thing is we already had a pool of willing eyes, some of whom were actually capable and willing, reporting in for free. So what we were really doing was we were looking for ways to align the market realities with what Microsoft actually needed. So again, it was that empathy that I had grown somewhere in a pink hoodie on a pen test way back, where it changed my view of understanding that this wasn't just about getting hackers paid, which I love that. It was about aligning Microsoft's engineering goals and the hacker community for better defense. So here, there we go. Here is the slide, the exact slide, not with that stuff on the side, but the exact slide that I used to convince Internet Explorer's management to not only launch the very first bug bounty at Microsoft, but to pay for their own bugs, which was very important. So what you are looking at is real data and a projection. So the real data is in blue, and these were how many vulnerability reports we received during the beta period of IE10. That's that low blue line. Then there's a break, and there's a big spike. Does anyone want to guess what that break was? Release, correct, thank you. It was what's called RTM, release to manufacturing. The code was out of beta, and it was ready to be final. And then suddenly, those altruistic hackers who at 200,000 email messages a year were coming forward to tell Microsoft, they would come forward all at once after beta was over. Why? Because the only incentive that they had was the hope that maybe they'd get their name 10-point Arial font spelled out in a Microsoft bulletin. Betas, typically, you don't get a bulletin for a beta bug fix. So we had inadvertently been incenting this group of altruistic hackers to hold on to their bugs till the worst possible time. Worst possible time. So this was the slide. And I had 12 slides, as you're always supposed to have 12 slides. When you talk to executives, I've been told 12 slides. This was slide number 2, and he said, yes, 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 I'm going to make it easy for you. How much? That was literally how that happened. He said, oh, right. So you want to put some money at the beginning of the beta period, you're going to traffic shape and you're going to move the spike? I'm in. How much? And that was that. And that was the birth of Microsoft's bug bounty programs. Now, how did this evolve into the Pentagon? Hack the Pentagon. Any of you heard of this thing? It happened this summer, yes. So when I was still at Microsoft, I had given a guest lecture at Harvard and MIT's little joint, biz school, policy school thing, and somebody from the Pentagon was there and invited me to brief the Pentagon because they had heard of these bug bounty things, but they thought this is going to be completely infeasible. There is no way to control this hacker world, and no, 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 no. We're not going to invite hackers to hack us. That's crazy. We're definitely not going to call it Hack the Pentagon. Out of the question. Not going to happen. Well, anyway, so there are a lot of really great people at the Pentagon who pushed this rock uphill. But what they did was they needed somebody who had come before, who had answered all the lawyers' questions, who had figured out the economic models, the game theory, all of that stuff, and constructed something that ended up being the very first successful pilot called Hack the Pentagon. So we were wondering if hackers would show up, if they would actually register and participate, because the requirement was you had to pre-register and you had to be willing to go through some kind of preliminary background check. Reporters, when they were asking me about it at the launch, said, okay, so they're all going to be drug tested? I said, oh, no, we want participants. We want them. We want the hackers to come forward. So no, none of that. But what actually they needed to do was they didn't need to be US citizens. They just needed to have a US taxpayer ID. So they could be foreign, but authorized to work in the United States, and just essentially turn over a social security number or taxpayer ID. And then if they found a bug that was going to get a bounty, then they would get a criminal background check. And the reason for that was the federal government in this very risky first program did not want to pay taxpayer money to convicted felons. That's their choice. Okay, then. I know some really nice felons. Really, really great folks. Really good at hacking, too. But the point was, for a pilot to be successful, they gave me a few criteria, the most important of which that I took to heart was, don't make us look like chumps. Don't make us look like chumps. And so this is not chump at all. This is actually pretty good. We were hoping for 500 hackers, over 1,400 came forward. And that was just an indication of how much they were excited that for the very first time, not only would the US government pay them a little cash, but for the first time they were being invited to tell the US government, at least a small part of it, about vulnerabilities they found but were afraid to report for fear of legal repercussions, drones from the sky, you name it, they were afraid of it. I almost sent tinfoil to many of my friends after this was announced. Almost, came real close. Until I did point out that, by the way, if you're worried about giving the government your social security number, they gave you that number. They know who you are already. Anyway, so 138 vulnerability reports in about 22 days. The first report coming in 13 minutes past midnight. Note to self, do not launch these things at midnight. Do not do. Because the hackers will be fast. So then what happened? Last Friday, seriously, okay, there we go. Last Friday, I was in Austin, Texas, and that is Secretary Fanning of the Army, who simultaneously announced Hack the Army, which is the next iteration of these government hacking programs where it is not only legal, but you will get paid. Announced this at the same time as, awkwardly for us, announcing that he was planning to leave because of the current administration. He is the first openly gay Secretary of the Army to serve. And anyway, Hack the Army is happening. At least there's that, right? And this challenge will go off before the inauguration, in case you're wondering. So anyway, what did this teach me about bug bounties and everything? It was not that there's one size fits all and whatnot. And most of the people who come to me for bug bounty advice, I end up talking them out of it. I end up talking them out of it because, to me, it's much more important to have that foundational layer on your journey, of dealing with vulnerability reports at all before you embark upon something as rigorous and will stretch all of your operational capabilities, if not done properly, of starting a bug bounty program. I don't run marathons. My brother does. I'm more of a mathlete in the family. But he tells me that, if you want to run a marathon, you really have to train for it. And I apply the same principles to doing anything that accelerates how many vulnerabilities are reported to you. So whether that's starting a new vuln disclosure program when you've had nothing, or it's kicking it into the next level of starting with certain types of bug bounty programs, whether they're private or public, or some variation like adult pen test friend finder, like I was saying, of the private, fully vetted characters who are in your bounty pool, all of that stuff, you still need to train. And then the fact of the matter is, a lot of organizations and a lot of different verticals outside the technology sector, banking, healthcare, automotive industry, other kinds of manufacturing, medical device, they all say, no, but we're special, and here's why we're so special. And I say, you are special, except that you're not when it comes to vulnerability disclosure. And honestly, we have seen already the deployment of patches in sort of an IoT, early IoT environment, and that's with our mobile devices, right? I remember the early days when Microsoft was trying to put the Windows Update client on the device, and then negotiating with the phone carriers, and negotiating essentially all up and down their entire ecosystem of their supply chain for this one thing, right? This one device. We've barely been scratching the surface on how to deploy updates, even once you have all of this vulnerability capability handling in place, let alone how do you get all of those fixes out into the wild. Okay, so now it's time to pray. We will pray. So one of the things that I stopped doing when I stopped being a traditional penetration tester wasn't just to try and expand and allow more people to eat at this feast of a table of bugs, right? As I did with starting those vuln research programs and those bug bounty programs. One thing I did was I realized that there were standards being written by people who weren't practitioners of vulnerability disclosure and whatnot. And so Microsoft had asked me, hey, Katie, this always starts with them. Hey, Katie, can you look into, and what happened was it was looking into the ISO standards for vulnerability disclosure. How many of you heard about them? They were actually started by the Canadian national body. Anyway, the ISO standards for vulnerability disclosure are 29147. I'll mention them a little bit later in the slides. But that was originally, I was sent to basically investigate what's going on and just make sure that it does no harm. And I said, do you realize that I used to hack things for a living before you guys got your hands on me, and now you want me to go be a standards wonk? And they said, yes, please go do that. And so for the last almost 9 years, it's amazing, I have been working on ISO standards and then steadily creeping into more and more policy realms. Okay, so this is me a couple weeks ago in Abu Dhabi. This was 3 hours that I had left over at the end of basically 12-hour days editing ISO standards. So everyone says to me, oh, you get to go to the neatest places and do the coolest things. And I'm telling you, this image represents 3 hours of free time during a week that otherwise I was spent in windowless conference rooms arguing with old men, mostly old men, about the placement of a hyphen. So go ahead and be jealous. Jealousy, right there. Yes. So, oh, come on. Super slides, yes. Okay, this is the other thing that I've done to myself in my strange evolution in old age. So as I've gotten more and more a part of the overall policy and regulatory, global regulatory regime, I've decided that, one, I'm going to dye my hair whatever the hell color I feel like, number one. Number two, that occasionally I'll open up a keynote with a live karaoke performance with backup dancers, and they also had fire. This was KiwiCon last year, and the title of my talk was Swinging from the Cyber Leer, How to Navigate, Cyber Regulations Without Dying, or something like that. But essentially, I opened up with a musical number. Unfortunately, they did not have the harnesses here, nor the pyro, nor the dancers, nor am I crazy enough to do this again. But I did this, and then I talked about the Wassenaar arrangement. How many of you have heard about the Wassenaar arrangement? Okay, great. So, yeah, this dark photo, I blame Dave Attell for the darkness of the photo, but all that says in that sign that you can't read and the junk there is that it was a construction site right in front of the Commerce Department. And those of us in the United States who were trying to deal with the Wassenaar arrangement from an industry perspective were navigating over this rubble rocky road right into the Commerce Department and trying to give our expert witness testimony to the folks who were then going back and potentially renegotiating the Wassenaar arrangement. So what is it? Woo. All right. What it is, for those of you who are not familiar, it is 41 countries originally designed as a non-proliferation treaty, a voluntary treaty, really, about trying to control the exports of things like nuclear weapons or the components or the technology to make nuclear weapons, similar type of weaponry. In 2013, they added some different sections that govern our space, cybersecurity. So in the 41 countries, only the United States had been the last of the holdouts who hadn't implemented their own domestic export control rules to conform with this agreement. The agreement went into place in December 2013. I don't think I mentioned the timing of when I launched Microsoft's first ever bug bounty programs, but that was June of 2013. I've been told by my wonderful Microsoft legal counsel, who still works there and I'm still really good friends with, that had the Wassenaar arrangement been passed at that time, I would not have been able to launch those programs. Now, I didn't tell you the frequency by which we were learning about new mitigation bypass techniques before those bounties, before that $100,000 bounty. It was roughly once every 3 years. And those are the types of issues that you can't fix on a Patch Tuesday. You have to re-architect some of the basic levels of the platform. So learning about them after they're already public and out, about 3 years, between learning about every one, we changed that to that bounty has been paid out, I believe, over 5 times in the last 3 years. And that means that people are coming forward. They are willing to pay or willing to license their technology. They're not selling it to Microsoft for $100,000, but it's an open license in exchange for $100,000 of their brand new mitigation bypass techniques. The problem with the Wassenaar arrangement is that it regulates the export of those techniques, among other things. It added, let's see, intrusion software and intrusion software technology. I won't put you to sleep completely by quoting like which subsections of this thing deal with those, but suffice it to say that the technology transfer elements of the Wassenaar arrangement stood to basically cease all vulnerability disclosure type of exchanges of information across borders, because you wouldn't know until you actually did your triage whether or not you've actually committed or somebody else committed an export violation, right? And asking for licenses and applying for licenses each time was going to grind everything to a halt as well. So that's the vuln disclosure part. Think about the cybersecurity incident response part. If you're passing around command and control software for the latest and greatest botnet, you are potentially in violation of export agreements that went into effect around 2013. Who knew? Who knew? Did anyone know? No. So what a bunch of us tried to do was point out that the practical application of these controls was not actually conducive to security. And it came from a good place. They were trying to limit the propagation of some of these things that could affect human rights if they got into the hands of nation states that would use them to surveil their own people, or dissidents or journalists in foreign countries. These were all ways in which this category of software had been used, and why they actually added these to the export controls. Okay, that's great stuff. However, so of course they meant well. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So last year, the United States Commerce Department basically said, we're going to put out a draft export control rule, and we're going to ask the industry to give commentary. They received, I believe, somewhere north of 260 different comments. some of which were obvious trolls, saying that we support this and we hope that it, engenders the overthrow of the United States government, stuff like that. But some stuff was actionable and was real, similar to some of those statements that I was just saying about how it interferes with common defensive activities in real time. And at that point, about a year ago, I thought for sure the State Department's just waiting for me to leave the country, and then when I hear that noise, that drone's for me. Oh my God, they're after me. Earlier this year in June, I got an email from the State Department saying, Katie, we're going back to the experts meeting at Wassenaar, and we would like for you to join the official US delegation to renegotiate this arms control deal. And I was like, sure, I would love to do that because I've just launched my own company a month ago, and I would love to stop everything. And yes, of course I went. So of course I went. So that was the first of 2 experts meetings that I have been privileged to attend on behalf of the United States in renegotiating this arms control deal. Quite a strange leap from the pink hoodied, hacking these video games and literally sending console messages to the beta players saying Hello Kitty owns you, to being asked to renegotiate an international arms control deal. Sure, I love that. But this has been a strange journey, and I wouldn't be telling you this journey if it didn't resonate for me as sort of my overall evolution of how I look at security as a whole. So remember how I said $100,000, right? That originally was thought to not be enough. The first recipient, his name was James Forshaw. He's British. He lives in England, one of the 41 Wassenaar countries. And he submitted the very first qualifying mitigation bypass technique. And then, of course, when I called him to let him know, he was going to be invited to the Blue Hat Conference, which is still running there. It was started by Window Snyder back in 2004, I think, at Microsoft, and it's their own internal hacker conference where they invite hackers from the outside to give talks and demonstrations to the developers and the executives to basically scare the bejesus out of them into doing better with security, right? And he said to me, he's like, Katie, I picture you handing me a giant check on stage at Blue Hat. I do a terrible James impersonation. He's heard it so many times at this point. But he expected a giant check. And so I immediately contacted the marketing people and I said, James wants a giant check. Get him a giant check. And there it was. We had our very first. And in fact, our last coming from one of the Wassenaar countries. So the rest of the recipients of this particular reward were either already in the United States and giving it to a US company, so there's no export there, or they came from China. So the real effects, even though this export control has not been implemented in the United States, the real effects on the potential of, there's that, what is that? FOMO, fear of missing out? We are missing out. We are absolutely missing out on the global defenders who are potentially able to come up with these new mitigation bypasses that a vendor like Microsoft or any vendor that makes a complex product with a big supply chain has to be able to deal with as much lead time as possible. So yes, it worked. Yes, it continues to work. But we are observing a change and a shaping of who is participating in this defense, vulnerability, and exploit economy that is brand new, as it's being potentially regulated out of existence by well-meaning people. So yes, they are right now, and I didn't show up until early afternoon today because I was in my room still working with some of the Wassenaar countries remotely. Not you guys, Canada's cool, you guys are cool. But there are some other countries that have not yet approved some of the changes that we wrote in during those 2 meetings that we had in Vienna over this last year. They still haven't approved them. And what I fear today, now that we've had that election, is we don't actually know from a cybersecurity policy perspective what the new administration will prioritize. We have a clear US position at this point that we must renegotiate these things, and we've convinced almost all of the 41 countries that this is ultimately a dragnet that is caught up too much in its attempts to protect the innocent, right? But we just don't know. So it's a big question right now. If we don't get agreement this year, I might not be joking about that State Department drone next time I leave the country. We might not get sent back, and folks like me and folks who have been working on these types of problems for a long time, may be told to just shut up and pen test some more. So finally, the love stage. Now, I have a whole section in here, and I'm pretty sure I only have like 15 minutes left. Is that true? Who's keeping time for me? I have 10 minutes left. So I'm going to sum it up for you. I will click through some of these slides, but really there's a video where I actually talk through a lot of this stuff in about 6 minutes. And I don't want to spend my 6 minutes talking through vulnerability coordination maturity model, but it's essentially the melding of what I learned as a hacker practitioner, what I learned working for a giant mega corporation, what I learned reporting security vulnerabilities to organizations and governments of all sizes and capabilities. These were the 5 different capability areas that I noticed were great indicators of huge success or miserable failure. So I'm just going to click through real quick because what you really want to know. All right, so this is the maturity model. How many of you use maturity models at all? Right? This is the very first one and the only one for vulnerability coordination. Right? So there are maturity models for incident response, tons and tons of those. That's when something bad has already happened to you. There are maturity models for building more secure code if that's what you happen to do. Not everybody does that. That's great if you build code. But there's been no maturity model yet for vulnerability coordination. And this is the first one. So essentially, organizational, analytics, communications, engineering, and incentives. A lot of people think it's super easy. All you have to do to start a vulnerability disclosure program is just put up an email address, and then magic will happen. So organizationally, you just have to have some agreement that you're going to do something about bugs that come in. At the very expert level, you've got not just these processes that you follow where you're going ahead and you're following your ISO standards, ISO 29147, ISO 30111, your religious moments, in trying to follow the rules and be pious when it comes to vulnerabilities. This is at the expert level where you actually have dedicated personnel. The idea behind this maturity model is, remember I mentioned I had been a Linux developer at one point in time. I was able to get 2 out of 3 of these maturity levels all by myself. I had permission from my management to take on yet another hat with no increase in pay and decide to do a security program, right? But I wrote down what I was doing. I propagated what it was. I created a playbook. And there we were. We were at the second stage, and it was an army of 1. So actually an army of part of 1 because I was actually supposed to write code and ship it as well. Next one, engineering. This is where everyone thinks they need to concentrate all of their resources. And that's great until somebody says, you know what, all these engineers should be working on our next product or our next website or our next service or whatever it is. And you get your engineers constantly taken away. Now, I mentioned with the Microsoft bug bounty program, there was a way to actually align exactly what the engineers were working on with exactly what you wanted the hackers to go look for. And that was a way to use a bug bounty as a structured incentive program to carve out, this is what we want you to look at, this is when, and you'll get paid, and you'll get your name up in lights. And it totally worked. All the way. Also interesting is that bug reports for other versions of IE dropped to near 0 that month. They were literally all just gunning for IE 11. So. Okay, so engineering-wise, you have to have a way to deal with these things at the very expert level. You have to be able to do root cause analysis and ideally stop making the same programming mistakes over and over again. Eliminate entire classes of vulnerabilities where you can. But this takes a degree of doing it for a while to be able to start identifying those patterns. Communication, because dogs and cats should talk to each other before they live together. Communication is really important, not just between you and the finder. Potentially, this is an issue where, it's a customer or it's a publicly disclosed issue and you have to go deal with it. At certain levels, you're going to have to differentiate your communication between different audiences, technical audiences versus non-technical audiences, potentially government regulators if you're in that space. And then the last bit, experts, structured information sharing programs with coordinated distribution of remediation. So how many of you have heard of the MAP program, Microsoft Active Protections Program? So that's a program that was launched in 2008 where Microsoft will actually give proof of concept exploit code and detailed technical information to defense service providers like antivirus companies, IDS, IPS. And the reason for that is they give it to them with enough time that those folks can build protection signatures so that they roll out at the same time as Patch Tuesday patches. That is what's called expert, where you're able to mobilize all of your defenders in the ecosystem to come out at once and coordinate that way. Analytics. So obviously, you need to be able to analyze what's coming in to try and improve not just your process for handling the vulnerabilities, but actually how you're dealing with deployment. If you're an all deployment house and you don't write any of your own code, you just deploy other people's, or if you're a development house and you do or somewhere in between. Real-time telemetry of active exploitation at the expert level. That could probably be summed up in watching for indications that something is being exploited in the wild. How many of you recently heard about Microsoft and Google having yet another disclosure argument, right? Yes. So Google said, we're following our policy and we're releasing this within 7 days because we see evidence of exploitation in the wild. So I think Microsoft executives said, their usual tisk, tisk, thou shalt not. Well, I wrote Microsoft's full disclosure policy, and there is actually a provision for that in there. It's just written a little bit differently, and it follows a different trajectory of mapping where you actually have to start responding and start not necessarily dropping 0-day, but start sending out notifications to people about a vulnerability that has not yet been patched, but you are seeing exploitation in the wild. There are provisions for that in both of their security policies and coordinated disclosure policies, just different triggers. But knowing this and being able to pivot on that information, that's the advanced or the expert level. Incentives. At the very least, saying that you will not pursue legal action against hackers who come forward with vulnerability information and give you a little chance to fix it, the very least, that should be the bare minimum incentive, and put up a way for them to contact you. Obviously, you can expand into financial rewards, but again, that is not for people who have never done this before, typically. At the expert level, you understand what your adversary behavior is. You understand what the markets look like for your vulnerabilities. If your vulnerabilities are even traded in other markets, not all of yours are, but certain of them are. And certain of the products you deploy, those vulnerabilities are traded in other markets. But understanding those markets and being able to manipulate them, like the traffic shaping I showed you earlier. So someone's going to disclose a bug to you. Someone will breach you. It is not a matter of if, it's when. I won't ask you to raise your hands of who have had a vulnerability disclosed to them or who has been breached, because it's all of you. Let's see. So what is the actionable stuff that you can do? Not only does it make sense for you to take your own security journey here, figure out where you are in the maturity of looking at vulnerability information. How many of these capabilities do you even have? Have you thought about a scenario in which it's not your bug at all, but it's the next heartbleed, and you've incorporated it or you've deployed it somehow in your networks, and you have to be able to respond. You have to be able to coordinate. Have you thought about it? Well, looking at this, your first steps can be to start a vulnerability disclosure program. Definitely not a good idea to start out the gate with a bug bounty program if you're not ready. And then finally, to take it back a level, this was my security journey. This was what I've spent the last, oh God, it's almost 2017. Okay, what I've spent the last almost 18 years doing professionally in some form, and much longer than that as a hobbyist. All of our journeys are going to be different, but one of the things that I look at is that questioning the existing models and building a model that takes a more holistic view of all of the data that you're really looking at, and not just the data, but the behaviors of the parties involved. What are their motivations and what do they want? To me, that's always been the key in convincing large organizations or governments to do something they had sworn they would never do, and actually to their great benefit if they started doing it, but not like crazy people who tried to run a marathon if they've never actually gotten off of their couch, right? The last thing I'll say is the internet has no borders. We are a global network of defenders. And this administration or not, I plan on continuing that work, and I hope you'll join me. Thank you.